I'm Delphine, 32 years old, and I once believed I had found my fairy tale ending with James, a brilliant doctor I met in college. That dream quickly morphed into a nightmare when his mother Eleanor entered our lives. She gave me an impossible choice: divorce, her precious son, or watch as she systematically destroyed everything I loved. With tears streaming down my face, I signed those divorce papers. But what happened next, Eleanor broke in ways none of us could have predicted. Let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you want to hear how I found strength in my darkest hour. Growing up in a small town in Vermont, I always had simple dreams. I wanted a career helping others, a loving family, and a life filled with laughter. After completing nursing school, I landed my dream job as a pediatric nurse at Boston Children's Hospital. My parents were so proud, especially since I was the first in our family to move to a big city and establish a professional career. My younger sister Abby would visit me often, and we'd explore the city together, marveling at how different it was from our quiet hometown. Dating in Boston wasn't easy. I had a few relationships, but nothing ever felt quite right. Either the timing was off, or we wanted different things in life. I had almost resigned myself to being single when fate intervened. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the hospital was hosting its annual fundraising gala. As a staff member, I was invited, but wasn't particularly excited about attending. My colleague Lisa convinced me to go, saying, "You never know who you might meet." How prophetic those words would turn out to be. The ballroom was decorated with elegant flower arrangements and twinkling lights. I was admiring the decor when I accidentally bumped into someone, causing my champagne to spill slightly on my dress. "I'm so sorry," a deep voice said. When I looked up, I found myself staring into the warmest brown eyes I'd ever seen. "I'm James," he said, offering me his handkerchief. I should watch where I'm going. James Harrison was a new cardiothoracic surgeon who had just completed his residency. He was tall with dark hair that had a slight wave to it, and when he smiled, small dimples appeared on both cheeks. We spent the entire evening talking, discovering our shared love of old movies, hiking, and Thai food. By the end of the night, he had asked for my number, and I gave it without hesitation. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant near the harbour. James was attentive, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely listening to my answers. He spoke about his passion for medicine and how he hoped to someday work with Doctors Without Borders. Unlike other men I had dated, James never tried to impress me with material things or boast about his accomplishments. Instead, he was humble and sincere. As we continued dating, I fell more deeply in love with him. He would leave little notes in my locker at work, bring me coffee during long shifts, and always made time for me, despite his demanding schedule. We complemented each other perfectly. His calmness balanced my occasional impulsivity, and my outgoing nature helped bring him out of his shell. After 14 months of dating, James planned a weekend trip to Cape Cod. We spent the day walking along the beach, and as sunset approached, he suggested visiting a nearby lighthouse. As we climbed to the top, the view took my breath away. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, painted in shades of gold and pink by the setting sun. When I turned around, James was on one knee holding a small velvet box. "Delphine," he said, his voice slightly trembling, "you've brought light and joy into my life in ways I never thought possible. I want to spend every day making you as happy as you've made me. Will you marry me?" Through happy tears, I said yes. The ring was perfect, a vintage emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds. James explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, who had been married for 60 years. It felt like a good omen. As we planned our wedding, James mentioned that we needed to visit his mother Eleanor at her home in Connecticut. He seemed uncharacteristically nervous about the meeting. "Mum can be a bit particular," he warned. "She has very traditional views about family." "Don't worry," I assured him. "I'm sure she'll love me once she gets to know me." James smiled, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite read at the time. "Just be yourself," he said. "That's who I fell in love with." I spent hours picking out the perfect outfit for meeting Eleanor, settling on a conservative navy blue dress that I thought would make a good impression. I even practiced potential conversation topics, wanting so badly for her to accept me as part of their family. "My mom means well," James told me during the drive to Connecticut. "She just gets very involved sometimes." I squeezed his hand reassuringly. All mothers are protective of their sons. It's natural. If only I had known then just how protective Eleanor Harrison would turn out to be. If only I had seen the warning signs in James's nervous behavior. Perhaps things would have turned out differently. But as we pulled into the long driveway of an imposing colonial home, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, I was still blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to engulf my life. Eleanor Harrison's home looked like something from a luxury magazine, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and furniture that appeared too perfect to actually use. She greeted James with a warm embrace, but offered me only a limp handshake, her eyes critically scanning me from head to toe. "So this is the nurse you've been telling me about," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The way she said nurse made it sound like I was somehow less worthy because I wasn't a doctor like her son. "Delphine is one of the most respected pediatric nurses at Boston Children's," James said proudly, but Eleanor merely smiled tightly and led us to the dining room. Throughout dinner, she peppered me with questions that felt more like an interrogation. Where had I grown up? What did my parents do? Where had I gone to school? With each answer, her lips would purse slightly, as if each revelation about my middle-class background was disappointing. "James was always expected to marry someone from a similar background," she commented, while delicately cutting her beef tenderloin. "The Harrison name carries certain expectations in Connecticut society." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing to contradict his mother. It was the first time I had seen him so passive, and it unsettled me. As the evening progressed, Eleanor made several backhanded compliments about my simple upbringing and how refreshing it must be to not worry about social obligations. When I mentioned our wedding plans for a ceremony at my family's church in Vermont, followed by a reception at a local inn, she laughed lightly. "Oh dear, that won't do for a Harrison wedding. I've already spoken with the event coordinator at the Westbrook Country Club. They can accommodate us next June." "Mum," James finally interjected, "we were thinking of something smaller and more personal." Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. I've already put together a preliminary guest list of about 300 people. On the drive home, I expressed my concerns to James. "Your mother seems to have very specific ideas about our wedding." "She's just excited," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Once we set firm plans, she'll understand." But Eleanor didn't understand. Over the next few months, she inserted herself into every aspect of wedding planning. She changed our venue without consulting us, added dozens of her friends to the guest list, and even scheduled a dress fitting at an exclusive boutique, rejecting the gown I had already fallen in love with. "That off-the-rack dress isn't suitable for a Harrison bride," she insisted. Each time Eleanor overstepped, I would look to James to support me, but he would often just sigh and say, "It's easier if we just go along with it. She means well." By the time our wedding day arrived, it barely resembled the intimate, meaningful ceremony we had originally planned. Instead of my childhood church, we were married at an elaborate Gothic cathedral in Hartford. Instead of a reception filled with close friends and family, we were surrounded by Eleanor's social circle, many of whom I had never met before. And Eleanor, despite the tradition that mothers of the groom should never wear white, arrived in a pale ivory gown that rivaled my own in extravagance. During the reception speeches, she took the microphone unplanned and gave a 10-minute speech about welcoming Delphine into the fold that somehow managed to be both patronizing and threatening at the same time. "A Harrison wife has certain responsibilities," she said, looking directly at me. "I'm sure Delphine will grow into the role with proper guidance." The first year of our marriage was marked by Eleanor's constant presence. She would show up at our Boston apartment unannounced, claiming she was just in the neighborhood. She would rearrange our furniture, criticize my cooking, and question my housekeeping abilities. "James works such long hours," she would say. "He deserves to come home to a properly kept house." When I would express my frustration to James, he would run his hands through his hair and say, "That's just how she is, Delphine. She doesn't mean any harm." But I was beginning to believe that she did mean harm. Every criticism, every uninvited visit, every undermining comment seemed calculated to drive a wedge between James and me. And slowly it was working. As our second year of marriage began, Eleanor's influence grew even stronger. She began suggesting that we should move closer to her in Connecticut. "Boston is no place to raise a family," she insisted during one of her surprise visits. "And that apartment is barely suitable for the two of you, let alone when you start having children." The mention of children was another constant pressure from Eleanor. She would frequently ask when we planned to give her grandchildren, regardless of who else was present during these conversations. "The Harrison line needs to continue," she would say, as if we were medieval royalty instead of a modern couple still finding our footing in marriage. When we resisted moving to Connecticut, Eleanor suddenly offered to help us buy a larger home in a more upscale neighborhood in Boston. James was excited about the offer, but I was wary. "We don't need her financial help," I told him privately. "We're doing fine on our own." "But think about it, Delphine. We could get a house years sooner with her help." What James didn't seem to understand was that Eleanor's money always came with strings attached. Sure enough, when we reluctantly accepted her assistance with the down payment on a beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, she insisted on having her own set of keys. In case of emergencies, she explained, though what emergencies would require her to enter our home from 2 hours away, I couldn't imagine. 6 months after moving into our new home, I discovered I was pregnant. James and I were ecstatic, and when we learned we were having twins, our joy doubled. However, Eleanor's reaction was unexpected. Twins run in the Harrison family, she declared, as if taking personal credit for the pregnancy. I'll need to help you prepare. First-time mothers aren't equipped to handle twins on their own. Before I could protest, Eleanor had inserted herself into every aspect of my pregnancy. She showed up at doctor's appointments without being invited, questioned the obstetrician's recommendations, and even argued with me about my birth plan. Natural childbirth for twins. Don't be ridiculous, Delphine. You'll have a scheduled C-section like I did with James. What disturbed me most was how James's behaviour began to change. He started working longer hours at the hospital, claiming it was to save money for the babies, but I suspected he was avoiding the tension at home. When he was present, he increasingly took his mother's side in our disagreements. Mum has raised a child before, he would say. Maybe we should listen to her advice. Without my knowledge or consent, Eleanor began preparing a nursery in her own home in Connecticut. The babies will need a proper place to stay when they visit, she explained when I discovered it during a forced weekend visit. But the nursery in our home is almost ready, I protested. Eleanor smiled that tight, insincere smile that had become so familiar. Of course, but they'll be spending plenty of time here with their grandmother. I've already discussed with James arranging regular weekend visits. James confirmed this, later explaining that he thought it would be good for us to have breaks from the babies. As my pregnancy progressed, I found myself increasingly isolated. My friends visited less frequently, uncomfortable with Eleanor's constant presence and critical attitude. My relationship with my own family became strained as Eleanor scheduled events and appointments that conflicted with their planned visits. My once confident personality began to wither under Eleanor's constant criticism. I developed anxiety about making decisions, second-guessing myself at every turn. Was I eating the right foods for the babies? Was I gaining too much or too little weight? Was the nursery properly prepared? Eleanor had an opinion on everything, and according to her, I was doing everything wrong. It's a good thing I'm here to guide you, she would say. Otherwise, who knows what might happen to those precious babies? Her words carried an undercurrent of threat that made my skin crawl, but whenever I tried to express my concerns to James, he dismissed them. You're being oversensitive because of the pregnancy hormones, he would say. Mom just wants what's best for our family. But whose definition of best were we following, and whose family was it becoming? These questions haunted me as my due date approached, and the answers I feared were becoming increasingly clear. My water broke 3 weeks early, sending me into a panic. James was at work, and I was home alone when the contractions started. I called him immediately, and he promised to meet me at the hospital. What I didn't expect was that Eleanor would arrive at our house before the ambulance I had called. James called me, she explained, bustling around, gathering the hospital bag I had already packed. Thank goodness I was already on my way to Boston for my hair appointment. At the hospital, Eleanor attempted to take over completely. She argued with the nurses about my room assignment, questioned the doctor about the monitoring equipment, and tried to override my birth plan. She'll be having a C-section, Eleanor told the bewildered obstetrician. Mrs. Harrison, we don't automatically perform C-sections for twins if the mother is healthy and the babies are positioned correctly, the doctor explained patiently. Well, we'll see about that, Eleanor muttered. As my labour progressed, it became clear that the twins were indeed positioned properly for a vaginal delivery. However, after 20 hours of labour, the doctor determined that the second baby was showing signs of distress, and a C-section would be necessary after all. See, I told you, Eleanor said triumphantly as they prepared me for surgery. James held my hand during the procedure, his face a mixture of concern and excitement. Lucas arrived first, followed by his sister Lily 3 minutes later. Both babies were small but healthy, with Lucas weighing 5 pounds 8 ounces and Lily at 5 pounds even. The joy I felt holding my babies for the first time was indescribable. But that precious bonding time was repeatedly interrupted by Eleanor barging into the recovery room, insisting on holding the twins and instructing the nurses on how they should be caring for them. The babies should be swaddled tighter, she would say, or That's not the right way to position a newborn for feeding. The nurses exchanged knowing glances but remained professional. One of them, an older woman named Ruth, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Harrison, your daughter-in-law needs rest to recover from major surgery. Perhaps you could visit again tomorrow." Eleanor was affronted but grudgingly left. When she was gone, Ruth patted my hand sympathetically. "We see her type all the time, honey. Boundary-stomping grandmothers who think they know everything. Stand your ground or she'll walk all over you." It was good advice, but difficult to follow when I was recovering from surgery and learning to care for 2 newborns. When James announced that Eleanor would be helping out by staying with us for a few weeks, I was too exhausted to protest effectively. "Just temporarily," he promised, "until you're back on your feet." Eleanor's idea of helping was taking over completely. She rearranged our entire home while I was still in the hospital, creating a more efficient space that suited her preferences rather than mine. She established feeding and sleeping schedules for the twins that ignored my desire to breastfeed on demand. "Babies need structure," she insisted, "and you need to pump so I can feed them too." When I objected, Eleanor would wait until James was present to raise her concerns about my parenting. "I'm worried about Delphine, James. She seems resistant to advice and quite emotional. I'm concerned about postpartum depression." These seeds of doubt planted in James's mind had their intended effect. He began watching me warily questioning my decisions regarding the twins and deferring to his mother's judgment. "Mom raised me successfully," he would remind me. "Her experience is valuable." Weeks turned into months, and Eleanor showed no signs of returning to her own home. She had effectively moved in, taking over the guest room and transforming it into her permanent space. The twins were 4 months old when the incident happened that would change everything. I had gone to the grocery store, my first solo outing since the births. When I returned, the house was quiet, which was unusual with twin infants. I called out but received no response. Concerned, I searched room by room until I found Eleanor in the nursery with Lucas and Lily, both dressed in white gowns I had never seen before. An elderly man in clerical attire stood beside her, sprinkling water on my baby's foreheads while reciting prayers. "What's going on?" I demanded, rushing forward. Eleanor looked up, momentarily startled, but not apologetic. "The twins are being baptized in the Episcopal faith, as all Harrisons have been for generations." Without my knowledge or consent, my voice rose in disbelief. "Where's James?" "At work, of course. He's aware of the baptism. We discussed it weeks ago." Whether James truly knew or Eleanor was lying, I couldn't tell. But in that moment, something snapped inside me. All the accumulated frustrations, boundary violations, and manipulations crystallized into a white-hot rage. "Stop this right now," I told the clergyman. "These are my children, and I did not authorize this ceremony." The elderly man looked confused. Mrs. Harrison assured me both parents had consented. "I'm Mrs. Harrison too," I said firmly, and I did not consent. After the embarrassed clergyman left Eleanor, and I had the confrontation that had been brewing for over 2 years. "How dare you undermine me like that?" Eleanor hissed. "You're making a spectacle of family matters." "They are my children, not yours," I responded, my voice surprisingly steady despite my internal turmoil. "You have overstepped for the last time." Eleanor's facade of genteel superiority cracked, revealing the true nature beneath. "Those children are Harrisons," she spat. "They are my legacy, not yours. You're nothing but an incubator, a nobody from nowhere who trapped my son with pregnancy." "I didn't trap anyone. James and I love each other." Eleanor laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "Love. Do you think love matters in a Harrison marriage? James will do his duty to his family name, just as his father did. And when he tires of your common ways, there will be a suitable arrangement, just as there was with his father and me." This cryptic statement confused me, but before I could question it, James arrived home early, walking in on our confrontation. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. Eleanor immediately transformed, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, James, I was just trying to uphold our family traditions for the twins, and Delphine became so angry. She ordered Reverend Phillips out of the house." To my horror, James turned to me with disappointment clear on his face. "Delphine, how could you? The Harrison baptism tradition is important to our family. She was having them baptized without even telling me, James. How is that okay?" But James was already comforting his mother, buying completely into her victim act. It was in that moment I realized how deep Eleanor's manipulation went, and how completely she controlled my husband. That evening, after James had gone to bed, Eleanor cornered me in the kitchen. Her tearful vulnerability was completely gone, replaced by cold determination. "Listen carefully," she said in a low voice. "You have two choices. You can divorce my son and maintain some dignity, or I will systematically destroy everything you care about. Your nursing career, your relationship with those babies, everything." "You can't do that," I whispered, though fear was beginning to curl through my stomach. "Can't I?" Eleanor smiled thinly. "I sit on the board of the hospital where you work. I have friends in the family court system. I have resources you can't imagine. Do you really think a judge would give custody of Harrison Ayres to a mentally unstable mother? I'm not mentally unstable. Your medical records could suggest otherwise. Postpartum depression can be so serious, especially in mothers of multiples. Sometimes it even leads to thoughts of harming the babies." Okay. Her implication was clear. She would fabricate evidence against me if necessary. James would never believe that, I said, but my conviction was wavering. James believes what I tell him to believe. He always has. Eleanor's eyes were cold and victorious. "You have 1 week to decide. Divorce my son, or I'll make sure you lose everything." The week that followed Eleanor's ultimatum was the darkest of my life. I moved through each day in a fog of disbelief and despair, caring for Lucas and Lily, while trying to hide my emotional turmoil from James. Every time I looked at my babies, my heart broke at the thought of losing them. I made several attempts to talk to James about his mother, but each conversation followed the same pattern. He would listen impatiently, then dismiss my concerns. "You're overreacting again," he would say. "Mom is just trying to help. Why can't you appreciate everything she does for us?" It became increasingly clear that James was so deeply enmeshed in his mother's manipulation that he couldn't see the reality of our situation. Years of conditioning had made him blind to her controlling behavior. I noticed other concerning changes too. James had become secretive about our finances. When I tried to use our joint credit card for baby supplies, it was declined. When I asked James about it, he seemed evasive. Mom suggested we rearrange some accounts to better plan for the twins' future, was all he would say. I secretly contacted my friend Megan, who worked as a family law attorney. We met at a cafe far from home while Eleanor was taking the twins for what she called grandmother time at the park. "This is serious, Delphine," Megan said after hearing my story. "Eleanor sounds like a classic narcissist and she's using her money and connections as weapons. What can I do if I fight her? She's threatened to take the twins." Megan looked grim. "Unfortunately, her threats about the family court connections might not be empty. I've seen wealthy, connected grandparents gain custody in situations like this, especially when one parent is supporting them. So I have to choose between my marriage and my children." My voice broke. "Not necessarily, but you need to be strategic." Megan outlined some options, none of which seemed promising given Eleanor's resources and influence. As the days passed, my health deteriorated rapidly. I couldn't sleep, plagued by nightmares of losing my babies. I had no appetite and lost weight my postpartum body couldn't afford to lose. Anxiety attacks would hit without warning, leaving me gasping for breath and shaking. James noticed my decline, but attributed it to adjustment difficulties with motherhood. He suggested I see a therapist, unaware that this was playing directly into his mother's hands. If I sought mental health treatment now, she could potentially use it against me later. On the 6th day after Eleanor's ultimatum, I overheard a phone conversation between James and his father, who had divorced Eleanor years ago and rarely visited. "Dad, I'm worried about Delphine," James was saying. "She seems paranoid about Mom's involvement with the twins. Yes, I know, Mum can be overwhelming, but..." "What do you mean, history repeating itself?" There was a long pause as James listened. "That's not what happened with you and Mom," he finally said, his voice defensive. "She said you abandoned the family. Wait, what court records?" Another long silence. "I need to go," James said abruptly. "I'll call you back." This conversation gave me a spark of hope that perhaps James's father could be an ally. But before I could find a way to contact him, Eleanor made her move. She arrived the next morning with documents in hand. "Time's up," she announced when she found me alone with the twins. "Have you made your decision?" "I need more time," I pleaded. "No more time." Eleanor placed the papers on the table. "These are divorce papers already filled out. All you need to do is sign." I scanned the documents in horror. They stipulated that James would have primary custody of the twins, with me having only supervised visitation. There was no alimony, no child support, nothing to help me start over. "This is outrageous," I said. "No court would approve these terms." "They will when your mental instability is documented. and it will be one way or another. Eleanor's threat was unmistakable. Sign now while I'm still willing to allow you visitation at all. In that moment, faced with losing my children completely, or having at least some access to them, I made a heartbreaking choice. With tears streaming down my face, I signed the papers. Eleanor watched with cold satisfaction. You've made the right decision. I'll have my lawyer file these immediately. What Eleanor didn't know was that I had been making preparations of my own. After my meeting with Megan, I had begun gathering evidence. I had hidden small recording devices throughout the house, capturing Eleanor's threats and manipulative conversations. I had documented every financial change, every boundary violation, every instance of her undermining my parenting. And I had established a secret communication channel with James's father, Richard, who had his own reasons to distrust Eleanor. I moved out that same day, taking only personal belongings and leaving the twins with James as the divorce papers stipulated. The small apartment I had rented in advance felt empty and cold without my babies. That night I cried until there were no tears left, but beneath my grief was a steely determination. Eleanor Harrison had won this battle, but the war was far from over. When news of our divorce spread, Eleanor wasted no time in taking her victory lap. She hosted an elaborate dinner party at her Connecticut home, inviting her social circle to celebrate what she called James's new beginning. I wasn't there, of course, but I heard about it later from Samantha, the wife of James's colleague, who had been disgusted by the entire display. She acted like she was celebrating his graduation or promotion. Samantha told me during a secret coffee meeting, not the breakdown of his marriage and family. It was disturbing. According to Samantha, Eleanor had announced that the twins would be spending most of their time at her house to provide stability during this difficult transition. She had also hinted that she was already considering potential new matches for James, mentioning the daughter of a hospital board member several times throughout the evening. Meanwhile, I was living a double life. To the outside world, I appeared to have accepted the divorce and custody arrangement, dutifully attending the supervised visitations with Lucas and Lily twice a week. But in private, I was executing a careful plan. The recordings I had made of Eleanor's threats and manipulation had been copied and secured in multiple locations. I had also obtained financial records showing how Eleanor had systematically taken control of our assets, including documentation of accounts that had been transferred without my knowledge or consent. James's father, Richard, became an unexpected ally. After our initial contact, he shared his own experiences with Eleanor during their marriage and subsequent divorce. She did the same thing to my relationship with James, he explained during one of our clandestine meetings. She poisoned him against me, fabricated stories about abandonment and affairs. By the time James was a teenager, he wanted nothing to do with me. Richard had remarried and built a new life in California, maintaining only minimal contact with James over the years. I've always regretted not fighting harder, he told me. Don't make the same mistake I did. With Richard's help, I assembled a comprehensive documentation package. It included the audio recordings, financial records, testimonials from friends and colleagues who had witnessed Eleanor's behavior, and a detailed timeline of her escalating control and manipulation. Richard contributed copies of his own divorce proceedings, which revealed patterns of behavior startlingly similar to what I had experienced. 1 month after the divorce was finalized, my evidence package was ready. I sent copies to several key people: Richard James's younger sister who lived abroad, my attorney Megan James's closest friend from medical school, and most crucially to several of Eleanor's social peers who served on the same charity boards. I didn't send anything directly to James, knowing that Eleanor likely monitored his mail and electronic communications. Instead, I trusted that the information would reach him through multiple channels, making it impossible for Eleanor to intercept it all. The final piece of my plan involved Eleanor's carefully constructed social facade. Through Samantha and other sympathetic contacts, I had learned that Eleanor was scheduled to speak at a major charity gala benefiting the Children's Hospital. It was an event attended by everyone who was anyone in Boston's medical and philanthropic communities, and Eleanor had been planning her appearance for months. I arranged for Richard to attend as the guest of a hospital board member carrying with him copies of the most damning evidence. He was instructed to wait for the right moment, which came sooner than either of us expected. During her speech, Eleanor spoke sanctimoniously about family values and the importance of putting children first. As a devoted mother and grandmother, she declared to the assembled crowd, "Nothing matters more to me than ensuring children grow up in stable, loving environments." It was at that moment that Richard stood up from his table near the front. Is that why you threatened to fabricate evidence of mental instability against the mother of your grandchildren? He asked, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent ballroom. Eleanor froze, microphone in hand. "Richard," she stammered. "What an unexpected surprise." "I've recently heard some disturbing recordings," Richard continued, moving toward the stage. "Recordings in which you threatened to use your connections to remove 2 infants from their mother's care. Recordings in which you boasted about manipulating our son and destroying his marriage." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's face had gone deathly pale. "That's absurd," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Richard turned to address the crowd. "Many of you received evidence packages this week. I encourage you to review them carefully before continuing your associations with Eleanor Harrison." Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, noting the uncomfortable expressions on many faces, including those of her closest social allies. She gripped the podium tightly. "This is a private family matter that's being grossly misrepresented." She tried again, but her composure was cracking. "Private like the court records from our divorce?" Richard asked. "The ones where the judge noted your pathological need for control and manipulation of family members. Those records have also been shared." Eleanor's face contorted with rage. She pointed a shaking finger at Richard. "You're trying to turn everyone against me, just like you tried to turn James against me years ago." The mask had slipped completely, now revealing the true Eleanor to the stunned audience. She continued her rant, growing more incoherent and accusatory by the second. Many guests began to leave their tables uncomfortable with the public meltdown they were witnessing. Finally, Eleanor seemed to realize what was happening. She stared at the retreating crowd, at the whispers behind hands, at the shocked expressions of people who had respected her just minutes before. Something in her seemed to collapse inward. Her face went blank, and without another word she crumpled to the floor. The hospital gala ended in chaos, with Eleanor being carried out on a stretcher to the same hospital where James worked. The irony was not lost on anyone present. By morning, news of Eleanor Harrison's very public breakdown had spread throughout their social circle. The carefully constructed facade of the dignified philanthropic matriarch had shattered beyond repair. Eleanor's collapse at the charity gala was both physical and psychological. She was hospitalized for what was officially called exhaustion and dehydration, but the doctors who examined her, including a psychiatric consultant, suspected something far more complex. James was devastated and confused by his mother's breakdown. He took emergency leave from the hospital to be at her bedside, still unaware of the full circumstances that had led to this moment. It wasn't until his father, Richard, visited Eleanor's hospital room that the truth began to emerge. "James, we need to talk," Richard said, guiding his son to the hospital cafeteria while Eleanor slept under medication. "There are things about your mother. You don't know things about your marriage to Delphine. You need to understand." For the next 2 hours, Richard shared everything: the recordings of Eleanor's threats, the financial manipulation, the similarities to his own divorce decades earlier. He showed James court documents from their divorce that had been sealed, but that Richard had legally obtained copies of which detailed Eleanor's diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder and her refusal to comply with recommended treatment. "I failed you as a father by not fighting harder to stay in your life," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I let her control the narrative because I thought it would be easier for you. That was my greatest mistake." James sat in stunned silence, the pieces of his life rearranging themselves in his mind. Memories of childhood suddenly made more sense: his mother's emotional withdrawal when he didn't meet her expectations, her smothering attention when he succeeded, her systematic isolation of him from friends who didn't meet her approval. "Delphine tried to tell me," he finally said, his face ashen. "I didn't listen. I thought she was being difficult or oversensitive. I believed everything Mom said about her." "Eleanor is very convincing," Richard replied gently. "She believes her own version of reality so completely that others accept it too. It's part of her condition." In the days that followed, Eleanor was formally diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, confirming what the doctors had suspected during her divorce from Richard years earlier. The psychiatrist explained to James that individuals with NPD often experience severe decompensation when their carefully constructed false self is publicly exposed. "Your mother is experiencing a narcissistic collapse," the doctor explained. "When someone with NPD loses control of their narrative and faces public humiliation, it can trigger a profound psychological crisis. Eleanor would require extended inpatient treatment, followed by intensive therapy if she chose to engage with it, which many narcissists refuse to do. The prognosis was guarded at best. While Eleanor began her treatment, I was rebuilding my life piece by piece. I had returned to work part-time at a different hospital, found a therapist specializing in recovery from narcissistic abuse, and was fighting through the legal system to revise the divorce and custody agreements based on the new evidence. When James finally contacted me nearly 2 weeks after Eleanor's breakdown, his message was simple. I need to see you, please. We met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe near the public garden. The man who sat across from me looked nothing like the confident surgeon I had married. James was haggard with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression that spoke of sleepless nights and painful revelations. I don't know where to begin, he said after we had sat in awkward silence for several minutes. I'm sorry seems inadequate. It is. I agreed, my voice steadier than I felt. But it's a start. James nodded, accepting this. I failed you and our children in every way possible. I let my mother control our lives and validated your concerns and ultimately chose her over our family. There's no excuse for that. You were conditioned from childhood to prioritize her needs and perceptions. I said not to absolve him, but to acknowledge the reality. But you were still an adult making choices. Yes. James looked down at his untouched coffee. I've started therapy to understand how I became so enmeshed with her, why I couldn't see what was happening. The therapist calls it being a narcissistic extension. I existed to fulfill her needs and expectations, never developing a true self independent from her. We talked for hours, painful truth after painful truth emerging. James had discovered that Eleanor had been slowly transferring our assets into accounts only he could access, preparing financial leverage to use against me if necessary. He had found journals where she had detailed plans to remove me from their lives entirely once she felt the twins were old enough. She saw the children as Harrison heirs, not as individuals, James explained, just as she saw me. Over the following months, James and I began the slow, difficult process of rebuilding trust, not as husband and wife, but as parents committed to healing the damage done to our family. The divorce remained final. Too much had been broken between us. But we revised the custody agreement to share parenting equally. I joined a support group for survivors of narcissistic abuse, finding solace in the shared experiences of others who understood the unique pain and self-doubt that such relationships cause. Gradually, I reclaimed my confidence and sense of self. The hardest part, I confided to my group during one session, was doubting my own perceptions for so long. Being told repeatedly that my feelings weren't valid, that I was overreacting or imagining things. That's gaslighting, the group facilitator explained. It's a common tactic used by narcissists to maintain control. The fact that you've recognized it is already a huge step in healing. James committed fully to his therapy, unraveling the complex dynamics of his relationship with Eleanor and taking responsibility for his role in our failed marriage. He established firm boundaries with his mother, who remained in treatment but showed minimal insight into her behavior or its impact on others. The therapist says she may never acknowledge the harm she's caused, James told me after visiting Eleanor one day. Her protective psychological mechanisms are too strong. That's not your burden to carry, I reminded him. Your responsibility is to our children and to breaking this cycle. Lucas and Lily thrived in our new co-parenting arrangement. At 2 years old, they were too young to understand the family drama, but old enough to benefit from the more peaceful, authentic relationships that now surrounded them. James and I developed a parenting plan that prioritized their emotional well-being and healthy development, free from the manipulative dynamics that had characterized their early infancy. My relationship with my own family, which had suffered under Eleanor's influence, flourished once again. My parents became active grandparents, and my sister Abby was a constant supportive presence in our lives. As for Eleanor, she remained a complex figure in our story. After several months of treatment, she was released to a supervised living facility where she could continue outpatient therapy. Her social standing, once the cornerstone of her identity, was irreparably damaged. Many of her former friends and associates kept their distance, uncomfortable with both her behavior and her diagnosis. James maintained contact with her, but established clear boundaries about her involvement with the twins, always supervising any visits. Richard, too, showed compassion from a distance, arranging for her financial security while protecting himself from further manipulation. 3 years after Eleanor's breakdown, I found myself in a place I never expected, at peace. The anger and hurt hadn't disappeared entirely, but they no longer controlled my life. I had returned to full-time nursing, bought my own small home, and even begun dating again cautiously. One evening, as James was dropping off the twins after their weekend with him, he paused at the door. "I saw Mom yesterday," he said. "She asked about you." "Oh." I felt the old tension rise but breathed through it. "She wanted to know if you'd ever forgive her." James's expression was unreadable. I told her that wasn't a question I could answer. I thought carefully before responding. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. For me, it's about freeing myself from the weight of anger so I can move forward. "That's wisdom I'm still working toward," James admitted. The journey through narcissistic abuse and its aftermath taught me lessons I never wanted to learn, but now value deeply. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, but essential, especially when you're responsible for protecting others. I discovered that trusting your perceptions is a radical act when others are working to undermine them. And I found that even in the darkest moments when it seems you've lost everything, there can be a path forward to something better if you're brave enough to take it. The experience also showed me that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in fighting to keep something broken, but in having the courage to let it go and build something new. By signing those divorce papers, I hadn't given up. I had begun a different kind of battle, one for truth and liberation. Eleanor's breakdown wasn't a victory to celebrate, but the inevitable collapse of a false reality that couldn't be sustained. In its place, something more authentic and healthy could grow not just for me, but for James, and especially for Lucas and Lily, who would now have the chance to develop their own identities, free from manipulation and control. If you're in a situation where someone is trying to control your reality, question your perceptions, or isolate you from support, know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. Trust yourself. Document everything. And remember that even when it feels like you have no options, there is always a way forward toward healing and freedom. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice to protect yourself or someone you love? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and healing. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted opens the door to everything you truly need.